Hello and welcome to the National Security Conversation. Over the decades since its independence in 1947, India has witnessed a series of conflict-generated migrations from the Tibetans in the late 1950s to the East Pakistanis in the run-up to the 1971 war with Pakistan, to Sri Lankan Tamils and Afghans. The list goes on. A close analysis would tell you that in each of these instances, the Indian state's response has been varied and ad hoc. So why has our policy been ad hoc and non-uniform? Well, it's because India lacks a legal framework for refugee protection. In India's case, the major cause of the problem is its inability to distinguish between illegal migrants and refugees legally. Under the Foreigners Act of 1946, which defines foreigner as, I quote, a person who is not a citizen of India, unquote, the two categories of illegal migrants and refugees become conflated as one and the same. Indeed, there is little doubt that illegal migration is a threat to the socio-political fabric of any country with potential security implications. But to confuse distressed migrants fleeing conflicts with illegal immigration only leads to a lack of clarity in response and policy ambiguity. India is also not a party to the 1951 Refugee Convention and its 1967 protocol for good and bad reasons, in my opinion. First of all, the definition of refugees in the 1951 Convention excludes a criteria that pertains to the violation of economic rights of individuals, and New Delhi has traditionally highlighted it as a good reason for non-accession to the treaty. Secondly, the fact that refugee protection norms are under duress internationally and being violated by the global north, both in letter and spirit, means that the time is not right for India to accede to it. However, notwithstanding India's position on the global refugee protection mechanisms, why can't India have a domestic refugee law? There is nothing that holds India back from having domestic legislation on refugee protection. This kind of an overall absence of a legal framework for refugees means that India's refugee policy is reduced to ad hocism and ambiguity and subject to, of course, partisan politics. For the longest time, India has had a stellar record in refugee protection. Since the wave of Rohingyas fleeing persecution in Myanmar, there has been a palpable shift and hardening in India's stance on refugees based on their ethnic composition. Whereas, on the other hand, the Citizenship Amendment Act of 2019 paves the way for the accommodation of non-Muslim refugees from Afghanistan, Bangladesh and Pakistan. The very partisan and exclusionary nature of the legislation means that Muslim refugees fleeing persecution from these very countries, or Muslims in general, like the Rohingyas, are no longer tolerated, let alone accommodated under the changed domestic political context in India. The Rohingyas are only the latest wave of conflict-generated migrants to India, followed by distressed non-Rohingya migrants from Myanmar in the wake of the military coup in 2021. India's failure to support Afghan migrants fleeing after the Taliban takeover in August last year is another case in point. The Rohingyas have been leaving India for Bangladesh for the last month, whose foreign minister, Dr. A.K. Abdul Momen, has deemed it a serious concern. In a crisis-laden and conflict-ridden South Asia, the problem of refugees is simply not going to go away, especially for India, as the predominant power and the only stable democracy in the region. Any conflict-generated migration in the region means a refugee problem for India. Therefore, it is high time for India to consider legislating a domestic law on refugees. But before India does that, it would be interesting and meaningful to know how India has dealt with conflict-generated migration so far. To discuss the Indian state's response to refugees, as well as analyze the novel development in India to deal with whoever happens to be in power in another country, regardless of the nature of the regime, I have with me Dr. Avinash Paliwal, who is a senior lecturer in international relations and is the Deputy Director of the SOAS South Asia Institute in London. He is also the author of the book, My Enemy's Enemy, India in Afghanistan from the Soviet invasion to the US withdrawal. So Dr. Paliwal, welcome to the National Security Conversation.
Thank you for having me here. Happy, it's an honor.
Avinash, you wrote an article earlier this year titled Politics, Strategy and State Responses to Conflict-Generated Migration, Evidence from India. You write that states have incentives to either accommodate, tolerate or repatriate migrants displaced due to conflicts. What, in your opinion, determines the choice of one policy over another?
Thank you for asking that question, Happy. The line of inquiry, the reason why I pursued this was the mismatch that I've seen in state or governments, ideas of how to behave with refugees on first place and how we see the actual politics, and not just in India but globally so, right? Even countries who have signed the UN Geneva Convention perhaps are not often or always welcoming for whatever reason. There is this argument of humanitarianism guiding state responses to conflict-generated migrants, whether they're recognized as refugees or not. There's always been a mismatch, and the idea was to use the case of India, which has actually hosted people from various countries, especially from the neighborhood, but also beyond, and how to really decode the logic of the kind of responses that we have seen in different points in time. Now, the argument of that article, which I've come up with, is that it is a situational strategic context at that particular point in time when there is a mass influx of migrants due to conflict. That is very important to understand to make sense of why and how a state, could be any state, but definitely those who are non-signatories to refugee conventions, who are not bound by these international conventions, how they decide on what to do with them, right? And these contexts are determined by an interaction, a dynamic interaction between something which is very obvious but also very important, between the domestic political logic of a crisis and the international strategic logic. Refugees are not always liabilities to the exchequer or national security threats to the host state. They can also be assets depending on how they are perceived.
Strategic assets.
They could be strategic assets. They could meld easier with the host society or not. And these are questions that have to be kept in mind when looking at different conflict-generated crises, migrant crises that we have seen. So in that article, I look at basically independent India's response to arguably every regional migrant crisis, right from the post-partition, the movement of both Hindus and Muslims from East Pakistan, which led in 1949-50, which leads to the Nehru-Liaquat Pact, where repatriation is sought after a diplomatic resolution rather than use of force, or the Tibetan refugee crisis, or the Afghans coming to India during the 80s after the Soviet invasion, or the Chakma or Hajong communities being displaced from the Chittagong Hill Tracts even after the independence of Bangladesh, in the mid-1970s. So there is really a very rich set of cases to be analyzed as far as India and its response is concerned. And I think that has theoretical value in terms of making sense of some of the conceptual debates at an intersection of international security studies and migration studies.
Right. Avinash, I do get the domestic political environment that you're talking about. Can you enlighten us a little more on the larger external strategic environment? What are some of the factors or determinants shaping that environment as it were for a particular state at a given point of time?
So there could be various calculations, right from reputational costs and benefits at an international stage to the relationship between the home and the host state. I think that's perhaps one of the most potent. And of course, there is the element of global power aspirations of a country, of a power, right? Of especially a host state. If you think that there is value in welcoming migrants, which would increase your prestige, your reputation at a certain point in time, that is something that is often calculated by various countries, right? If you think that the entry of mass migrants will complicate relationship with the host state, with the home state, and how, in what ways does it complicate your relationship with the home state, that's very important. I'll give you an example, right? When in late 1950, after the Tibetan uprising in 1959, that period, around about late 50s, early 60s, there was a lot of Tibetans leaving Tibet, coming to India, right? There were multiple choices that the leadership of that time had, right? Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru, he could have refused them entry. He could have refused them the kind of shelter that was provided, including to the government of exile and including to the Dalai Lama when he came, right? But he did not. There was, of course, a domestic logic to it, that there is a huge, potent public sentiment in favor of Tibetans and Buddhists broadly, given the history of the relationship at a people to people, at a societal level. But there's also an international strategic relation to it, aspect to it, in terms of how you deal with Beijing or Peking at that point in time, right? How do you relate? How does this crisis impact your relationship with a country with whom your relationships are souring by the day at that point in time? So that is something absolutely critical. And I think the decision to accommodate was triggered by the fact that, one, domestically it will not be acceptable to reject them, not in an electoral sense, but the kind of broader context in which the public viewed the entry of Tibetans. There was a lot of sympathy. But at the same time, it gives India a certain degree of leverage in their dealings with China.
You know, I think the trouble, of course, is that having a refugee population in your country because they are refugees, they're helpless, is one thing. Yeah. But having them run a government in exile is a slightly different thing. For example, if China or Pakistan were to sort of have a Kashmiri government in exile, that would have been completely unpalatable for India.
Absolutely.
I'm just sort of throwing that out there for argument's sake. But I wanted to sort of focus a little more attention on a contemporary case. For example, the Indian treatment of the Rohingyas. Yeah. Where does that fit in your sort of theorization of how states deal with refugees, as it were? I mean, considering the global reputational damage that India may or may not face because of what it is doing, and the domestic sort of political environment.
So this is an interesting case. This is also an anomaly, because this is the first time that independent India is encouraging repatriation, and repatriation which is not based on any clear agreement, whether with Myanmar or, I mean, some cases have been done in consultation with the Myanmar government, but a lot of the Rohingyas who are leaving, and this is a very recent statistic, just last week, about 800 Rohingyas have left Jammu. They went to Calcutta, they crossed the border. That was also done by human smugglers, right? Migrant smugglers on both sides of the border. They have reached Cox's Bazar, and the government, the UN authorities, and these are people with UNHCR card, right? So this is a substantial number, if little in the larger scheme of the Rohingya crisis. But having 800 people cross over and 3,000 waiting on the border in Calcutta with the Bangladesh border, that's a sizable, this is groups of people who are leaving because there is a hostile environment for them, let's say in Jammu or elsewhere, right? Most of the Rohingyas are in Jammu, Delhi, Hyderabad. Yeah. So, and we can see there are statements being made by the Bangladeshi former minister which are very openly hinting of criticism against India. So clearly this is a case in terms of the theorization of this case, that domestic politics seems to have an upper hand over international strategic priorities, and that signals that the costs that India thinks it will bear, both with its relationship with Myanmar or with Bangladesh, are not that high by doing this. But the political benefit that they might have in terms of whatever electoral gain there may be is actually, that is much more powerful a determinant of this aspect. And let's be clear, this is not being done, the government is not asking them to go. So the government, it's not that the government of India has asked them to leave officially, that there is a repatriation policy. They would want, both Bangladesh and India would want to see serious repatriation to a safe home environment in Rakhine State. But the facts on the ground is that's not happening anytime soon. But India is not discouraging them from leaving if they go to Bangladesh and if they settle in Bhashanchar or elsewhere in Bangladesh. So this is a grey area where domestic politics is much more potent a determinant, if not of policy, but of approaches, broadly put, on this particular community.
So for the first time, as you write, in fact, you tweeted, this is for the first time since independence that refugees are leaving India in groups due to increasingly hostile environment. So when you say hostile environment or India's calculations, you're not really talking about an economic calculation. It's basically a socio-political calculation by the BJP government in India.
It's both economic and socio-political, and those things are tied up. It's not as if they were living, the kind of experience they had, lived experience in slums, essentially urban slums, in cities like, in Jammu or elsewhere. It's not that they were economically any better, and I'm honestly not sure that they'll have much economic prospect even in Bangladesh. There might be less, less hostility.
But could it be argued that they were an economic burden on India in Jammu, Delhi, or Hyderabad?
The numbers are so small in the larger scale of India's population that I don't see this as a burden. I think this is about the kind of, it's about politics. Let's be honest about that.
Right.
It's about politics. When you see routinely on social media where, people who are Indians being called Bangladeshi or Rohingya and, for communal purposes or whatever purposes, that has an impact. And as someone who has just traveled to Bangladesh and returned from there, let's be very clear, these aspects of India's domestic politics are not missed in neighborhood.
I mean, there was a statement, earlier this week by the Foreign Minister of Bangladesh, Abdul Momen, who said that unfortunately many Rohingyas are coming to Bangladesh from India, and he sees it as a matter of concern. What's the sort of feeling in Bangladesh? You've spoken to several people while you were there. What's the sense you're getting from there about this Indian policy of pushing them back or not letting them come in, unlike it used to do earlier on?
I think they see this crisis primarily as their own. They see India and China as the two powers who are part of a potential solution. The numbers of people, this is very recent first of all, this is one of the first statements Mr. Momen has made, and the movement of Rohingya away from India into Bangladesh is a very recent phenomenon, which in itself will not be, it might be an irritant between Dhaka and Delhi, but this will not really complicate the bilateral broadly as things stand, right? But as far as the Rohingya crisis itself, I think the public mood in Bangladesh is changing. The initial welcome that people felt that they need to be supported, there is a genocide happening in Myanmar, there are people who are being targeted systematically by the junta, by the Tamado. That welcome is going down. Going down. The political leadership, both of the Awami League and even other political leaders you speak with from other parties, they can see that this is the risk of a security crisis emerging from the Rohingya migrants who are put up in different camps in Cox's Bazar, elsewhere, or in Bhashanchar, but they are not really very well integrated in the Bangladeshi society. There is always a risk of security issue, this becoming a security issue increasingly so. So I think if there is a huge movement and uncontrolled, if this doesn't stop, if people of, who are Rohingya, who are in Jammu, or in other Indian cities who start crossing the border in large numbers, if this doesn't stop, there is a possibility of this becoming a bilateral issue moving forward.
Interesting. India has not signed the 1951 Refugee Convention or the 1967 Protocol. And yet, if you look at the history of the Indian approach to refugees, it's a great example. Going back to the various examples that you just mentioned, how do you sort of compare India's track record with that of the many Western states? And of course, India also made the argument that we are not signing the convention or the protocol because of the manner you define what a refugee is. You don't take into consideration, for example, the economic aspects of what makes up a refugee. So in that sort of a context, how do you sort of compare India's? I mean, obviously you are being critical, and rightly so, of the current policy, but taken together, going back to the last 75 years or so, how do you compare this track record with that of many of the Western states?
I think India's track record is, it's something which is appreciable for a country that has had a lot of economic issues itself, a country which is quite diverse and dealing with a lot of different fault lines, caste, class, language, ethnicity. And it's never easy to get migrants in big numbers and to settle them without questions asked or without creating some concerns, right? Let's even take the examples of some of the refugees or the migrants, conflict-generated migrants as I call them, because India does not accept, refugee is a legal term as well. The Chakma Hajong communities, which were settled, which moved out of Chittagong Hill tracts, went to different parts of Northeast, Tripura, Meghalaya. They were eventually settled in Arunachal. Starting 2018, there has been a liberalization of offering them citizenship, right? This is a very clear case where India is accommodating a community. But still we know that people in Arunachal Pradesh were not happy with this. But the central government took a decision that this is something that we have to move ahead with. And I think eventually the local protests have gone down. So that degree of friction has to be dealt with, and that is a strategic decision. If you compare this with a lot of different countries, I think the response by the United States to migrants from Mexico is a classic example. It's a very mixed record, and this is a signatory of the Geneva Convention, right? European responses to crises, the Mediterranean refugee crisis with the Syrian civil war is a classic case where most European countries simply refused to accept them. It was the Germans who eventually, under former Chancellor Angela Merkel, who decided that we'll take them, and she had to pay a political price for that from the far-right CSU, which used that as a political stick to kind of, complicate the CDU's sort of political standing, if you like, and that pushed her into declaring prematurely that she'll not stand for the chancellorship again in 2021. So clearly the record is mixed everywhere. Given India's capacities, I think we have done pretty well. Yes, how we treat refugees once they are in the country is a very different matter. But I don't think there have ever been an issue of we'll just not welcome them or preemptively stop them in the first instance till today, effectively.
I mean, given the fact that a lot of your population is under the poverty line, I mean, you can't obviously expect far better treatment of the incoming refugees. I mean, you can only treat them on par with your own population in that sense. But what I sort of fail to understand, Avinash, is this. Sure, you don't want to be part of the 51 convention or 67 protocol. I understand that because you don't necessarily agree with the definition of what a refugee is. But you can still have a domestic law. Under the Indian domestic law, we still don't sort of distinguish between illegal migrants and refugees. And I think that has complicated. So I'm sort of puzzled as to where this hesitation is coming from. Why is that we are unable to create a domestic law which sort of clearly distinguishes what is what? Or is it because a certain kind of ambiguity and ad hocism helps in sort of political utility, as it were? How do you sort of examine this?
The cynic inside me would go with the latter argument, Happy, that ambiguity helps. And look, let's be very clear. It's not that the BJP is particularly averse to conflict-generated migrants or refugees. I mean, the Congress did not want a lot of migrants and migration as well. The way they dealt with it was different. There was ideological differences, of course, when you're looking at migrants whose composition is, I mean, if they're Muslims or not, right? Those issues, the Citizenship Amendment Act, that politicizes that question in a different way. But both parties they were very clear that India would not want to take the burden of refugees beyond a certain point. I mean, we went to war in 71 for that reason. Primarily that, apart from the strategic benefit of going to war with Pakistan, it was also that there were 10 million refugees from that part of the world which had entered India, Bengal and Northeast. So I think having some degree of ambiguity helped, but I think that is still not a good enough reason to not have a legal clarity about these issues. I think I would say for India to debate how it wants to treat people who have come from outside during duress, that's a debate that is badly needed. That's a law that is perhaps something that we should have. There should be clarity about. But history has been such that till this point in time, we have not had a time or a moment or the capacity to actually, or even intent to a certain degree, to actually have that discussion with some degree of distance.
Right.
And coming back to your point earlier that they could be strategic assets and hosting a government in exile rather than just a community. Look, almost every, barring the Rohingya, almost every migrant community that has entered India has been armed secretly to a certain degree. Think about it, right? The Tamil Tigers, a lot of the secret training happened in India of the Sri Lankan Tamil community. The Shanti Bahini operated for a considerable period of time from Agartala. The 71 war, the Mukti Jodha, Mujib Bahini, these are classic cases in point. Tibetan. We created the SFF, the Special Frontier Force, which is very much central to India's kind of, it's central to Indian kind of force mobilization and postures, and we have seen the use of SFF during recent standoff in Ladakh with China as well. But India briefly also supported the Mustang resistance force with the CIA, along with the CIA, after the 62 war in Nepal. You look at the Afghan migrants who came here during the 80s, they were not used in a coercive way, in an offensive way, but There's a huge intelligence gathering aspect to it.
So what's your verdict? Is that, I mean, clearly LTTE did not sort of turn out to be all that fantastic for India, certainly not. But you could make the argument that 71 was a success. You could make the argument was the Afghan refugees. We did use them in the Northern Alliance and all of that. But so what's your verdict? Should states stay away from using refugees for their strategic purposes, or is that okay? Where do you stand on that?
It's a difficult question to give a very clear answer to, that they should or should not. Look, me saying they should not or me saying they should would not make any difference.
No, but as an academic, as a researcher, what's your...
As a researcher, I would say, if I were to think about the life of a migrant, which is already quite difficult, simple, if you think of it from a bottom line perspective, what do you do to the life of that person who's already dislocated, displaced and lost almost everything they had at home? Whatever decision you take, if that helps them achieving some modicum of normalcy and some modicum of livelihood and prospect, that is a policy that any state should take.
But that's not how it happens, because you're right that states can intentionally create, manipulate and exploit the so-called weapon of mass migration to serve national interests.
Yes.
So one is what we like, one is what really happens on the ground.
But you asked my personal opinion.
Exactly.
And that's where I am.
Let's shift gears a bit, Avinash. When the Taliban were in power from 96 to 2001, India did not recognize that regime, the Taliban regime. Now the Taliban is back in power in Afghanistan since August 2021. You actually tweeted, India cannot afford a rerun of its absence from Afghanistan like in 96 to 2001. It basically means two things. One, India should have stayed back in Afghanistan from 96 to 2001, and that India should have stayed back after August 2021. India is apparently going back. I mean, we had a team visiting Kabul very recently. So on the latter part, you may be accurate. On how do you sort of justify the first part? Should India have stayed back in Afghanistan after the Taliban killed its way into power in Kabul? And India was part of the Northern Alliance trying to push back these guys.
So you're asking about 96 or 2021?
96 to 2001.
Yeah. So there are two considerations here. When I say India cannot afford to have a rerun of its absence, this does not mean that the officials on the ground should overlook the risks that their colleagues or Indian officers run. India left in 1996 because there was a certain security context and there were limited guarantees of the safety of Indian officials on the ground in Kabul and elsewhere. And that was exactly the case on 15th of August 2021. You need some degree of confidence that the local allies that you have, the local government that exists, will be able to secure your livelihood. And those guarantees were not there in September 96 or in August 2021. So if any official took a decision on the spot that we need to first save our lives to be able to come back, I think that's a very good and a very justified decision at a pure tactical level. And I don't believe that is a sign of that's a sign of national weakness. I think that says a lot more about adaptability and maneuverability as well. The fact that they did not go back in after 1996 is where my question comes in. The Taliban wanted India to be back. The Taliban wanted a lot of countries to come back, deal with them, recognize them on the ground during the late 1990s. But it was a very different geopolitical context. India was recognizing a government which had some degree of international legitimacy, the so-called the Northern Alliance kind of, the United Front government at that point in time, at least on paper, at least at international institutions, and it was supporting the Northern Alliance with the Russians and Iran. The fact that when the 1999 IC-814 hijack happens, you don't have absolutely any presence or outreach in the Pashtun areas, I think that's where the question really comes in. This is a neighbor where you have spaces where you have absolutely no outreach, and that hurts in a national security sense at a crunch point. And I think that is one reason why India went so strongly in the Pashtun areas after 9/11 and the re-entry of the international community. That logic remains the same today. Fine, you left due to due to security threats or the intelligence that you were getting in August 2021. That's not the problem. The question is, do you go back or not? And I think this is a lesson learned from the late 1990s, that you cannot afford to not be there, even if it's a limited presence. You need to have outreach with whoever is in power in Kabul, so that you can at least avoid the recurrence, if not in entirety. At least you understand what's going on the ground better than you can sitting outside.
I mean, as I see your point, but let me throw this scenario for your consideration. One of the reasons, and it's again my logic, one of the reasons why there is calm in Kashmir today is because the Indians are absent from Afghanistan, and for the last 14 months, 15 months, we haven't seen much firing in Kashmir, very little. In fact, compared to the year 2020, when we had 5,000 plus violations last year, in the last 14 months, probably talking about 10-15 violations. Yeah. Very little infiltration, very few terror attacks. It's a quid pro quo. You're not there. They're not going to bother you in Kashmir on the line of control. If that were to be accurate, should India still go back to Afghanistan?
I personally believe that's not accurate.
Should that be accurate? We'll come back to whether that is accurate.
Even if there is a quid pro quo going on over here, let's assume there is a quid pro quo, and I understand where you're coming from. The logic of that I understand, even if I believe it's tenuous in practice. Yes, India still needs to go there precisely for that reason. Even if you look at it from a purely geostrategic kind of geopolitical balancing perspective, right? There is the relationship between the Taliban and Pakistan has really kind of gone through multiple circles since August 2021 till today. And I think there is a demand on the ground in Afghanistan to have interlocutors, regional interlocutors, and I'm not talking about diplomatic recognition. Just have more regional interlocutors with whom you can work with. And the other bit is you need to go there for the Afghans. Most importantly, you have a relationship with the people of Afghanistan, and however cynical one could be from a security perspective, those people are your biggest assets. The students who come on scholarships to India, the humanitarian aid you are giving, even if it's limited in large scale of things and the kind of economic situation there is in Afghanistan, the fact that you're giving wheat and you have done a lot of wheat diplomacy in the past, it's a symbol, right? It's a sign that you are not there to kind of dislocate.
It's more symbolic than substantive. I mean,
Sorry?
It's more symbolic than substantive.
Yes, but at least it shows a certain degree of intent towards what you want to do, right? You're not actively involved in the security politics of Taliban the way ISI is, where you see the former chief now of ISI Faiz Hamid still going back to Kabul, negotiating with the TTP. Imagine a Pakistani co-commander going to Kabul to negotiate a deal with the Tehrik-e-Taliban Pakistan.
And if India were to be president in Afghanistan, they would have pinned some of these attacks on India, like it has done in the past. TTP is funded by you guys. You are orchestrating these attacks. Now they can't pin it on us.
Look, Pakistan will pin it on us regardless of whether we are there or not.
So far they haven't.
So far they haven't because we are not there as well, and the attacks have actually gone up, and there is some degree of clarity in Pakistan also. Look, we cannot divorce the situation in Afghanistan with what is actually happening inside Pakistan.
Right.
I think the new government which has come into power, led by Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif, they are really dealing with some multiple acute crises, right from dealing with the split within the army, dealing with religious populism typified by Imran Khan, who's not going anywhere. He's shaping the politics and will shape the politics for some time to come, and an acute economic crisis which they did not plan for in this buzz for the China-Pakistan economic corridor, that everything will be sorted the moment Chinese finance comes in. That's not the case. And there are multiple insurgencies raging. The Baloch insurgency has taken a turn towards the south. So has the TTP, which was supposed to be done and dusted because of Operation Zarbeaz. So I think there are serious problems there.
Let's go back to your objection to the whole quid pro quo.
Yeah.
What's your objection to it?
Two objections. First of all, what happens in Kashmir is related to what is going on in the Kashmir and how the state of India is dealing with the situation on the ground. Let's be very clear. You said there is calm in Kashmir. I'm not sure there's calm in Kashmir. I'm looking at, you could call it enforced calm. My logic is not a normative one. Mine is a statistical one. Statistical one. Okay, fair enough. You're correct on the statistics. The kind of insurgencies we saw in Kashmir in the 90s, early 2000s, that don't exist. And the counterinsurgency grid is strong enough to quell that kind of insurgent mobilization, right? But that does feed to a lot of resentment of other kinds. And we do know that the recruitment is not dried up as far as a lot of these entities are concerned, the TRF and all the new groups which have come up over the past few years. But also look at the actual killings that have been happening, the targeted killings of Hindus, of Kashmiri Pandits, of non-local migrants, of police officers who form the eyes and ears of the police on the ground. These are Kashmiri police officers. Most other officers are from non-Kashmir cadre, the senior officers, right? So they are being targeted. So very clearly there is a, these...
Go to your first point, calm is not calm.
Calm is not calm.
Okay.
So that's one point. Secondly, we have to see what is actually going on in Pakistan and the cycles of change within Pakistan rather than what India does in Afghanistan.
Okay.
I think these two theatres have to be de-linked a little bit to be able to appreciate the complexities. I'm more concerned about how the new Chief of Army Staff of Pakistan will deal with Kashmir, because there'll be a lot of pressure to do something more visible in that sense.
Any idea who it's going to be?
It's difficult to say.
There is this new approach in Delhi. I mean, maybe it's not new. You can tell me whether you think it is new or not. That we will deal with whoever is in power in another country. Myanmar is a Hyundai in power. India is really not making too much noise about it. Afghanistan, you have Taliban back there. We are willing to deal with them. They went and met Taliban leaders, according to news reports. Is that new? One, is that the right approach in your opinion? Or you think a country that is deeply democratic, one of the biggest democracies in the world, should have a slightly more normative approach to regimes and how we deal with regimes in our neighborhood?
I think it's not a new approach. I think this is something that, in fact, I'll go back to all the way to the 50s, right? There was a debate whether India should recognize the coup by Ayub Khan in Pakistan in 1958. Nehru very quickly rubbished those kind of discussions that we have to deal with whoever there is. This is not in our hands, right? And we don't interfere in the domestic politics of our neighbors. Same in 1962 when General Navin came to power in Myanmar. Same with when Ziaur Rahman came to power after the assassination of Sheikh Mujib in 1975. Irshad in 81. Even the change over in Afghanistan in 92 when your ally, President Najibullah, was basically ousted by the Mujahideen. India was not working with the Mujahideen before. After that, it started to. I think that is not
96 to 2001, India actively helped the Northern Alliance against the Taliban.
Yes, that's the
when
one.
Musharraf came to power, India said, no, there was some concern in Delhi about dealing with the dictators. And then, of course, better wisdom prevailed on New Delhi. It started dealing with them. Myanmar, again, you are the expert here. There was a time when India was happy to host pro-democracy protesters in Delhi from Myanmar. We don't do that anymore. We do that, but not very happily.
Yeah. So it's not new, and the cases where it departed from this norm of dealing with whoever is in power, the dividends were not that high. So this is where the calculation changes, right? It's not about the ideas or the values of it. It should be, maybe, but it's not something that has really reaped kind of real security dividends for India. India realized that they were hosting the pro-democracy movement in 88,
China.
But at the same time, you were still having raging insurgencies in Assam and Nagaland, right? And that has, so for that you needed to reach out to other figures, including the junta in Myanmar. That's something they very clearly realized. Same with Afghanistan. You were not dealing with the Taliban in the late 1990s. You were trying to shape their politics by supporting their resistance. But then you don't get, you're not secure enough still. And IC-814 is a classic case in point which has kind of scarred Indian psychology as far as Afghanistan and the Taliban itself at least goes. So I think there is a realization that there are limits to how much you can disengage. I think there's still a preference for shaping the behavior of these countries in whatever way India possibly can. But the other thing is there is also an acceptance that India cannot expect a fully inclusive or electoral democracies in the neighborhood given the history of the post-colonial state,
right.
Post-Second World War. These are polities which are still, there's still a lot of trauma from 1947, from 1971, and these traumas continue to shape the politics, both of democracy and authoritarianism, in some fundamental ways. And at least as far as the policymakers are concerned, they are realizing the limits of their influence as well. in how democratic can you have, how much democracy can you possibly have in Myanmar? How much can can you use force to do that? I'm not so sure. So you might actually end up doing more harm if you try to go in with a liberal intervention or a democratic intervention, so to say, in that spirit, rather than actually stabilizing the situation, however however unsavory it might be in your own opinion. So I think that is something that has been considered.
Yeah, for example, I mean, during the 80s, India did intervene in Sri Lanka. In the early 2000s, the Sri Lankans asked, please come and help us. We said, nothing doing. So there is that learning from the past, as it were. You live and work in the West, in London, and there is an abiding discourse in the West about regime change, about democracy promotion. You don't see that in India, where you are originally from. So how do you sort of locate this sort of narrative in the West as differently from the narrative here in South Asia? I mean, you did mention the post-colonial aspects of the region, and that requires a certain different kind of treatment, as it were. Or is there any other insight that can sort of guide us in sort of trying to understand how the West approaches things differently? I mean, for example, let's take the recent case of the Western argument that is India with democracies or non-democracies. It's a fight between democracies and non-democracies. It actually fell on deaf ears in Delhi. How do you sort of see that difference in the normative conceptions of these two worldviews, as it were?
I think there are two aspects to this, fundamentally speaking, right? I mean, and this does go back to the moment of decolonization for not just India, for a lot of African Asian states, right? This is an experience which is a traumatic experience. They are trying to figure out new nationalisms, new identities in kind of, very diverse societies, and they're still using tools which were left by the colonial Raj to govern. So there is a contradiction there, right? And that continues to feature in domestic political kind of daily routines, let's say, politically and bureaucratically. But the fact that India has been very concerned about external interference in its own domestic affairs for a good moment after independence, I think that has shaped a considerable, that has whetted India's intellectual appetite to not be too liberal in using force. And as you mentioned, when they did use force, like in Sri Lanka or elsewhere, the results have been mixed. So there is this dilemma. India is not a shy country as far as use of force is concerned, actually. I think India is comfortable and has been comfortable using force. But it is also cautious to, that you can start conflicts, but you can't always end them at your own, That's always the biggest question. Russia has started a war in Ukraine. They're not going to decide the end of it as they wanted it to, right? So that is a learning which has kind of passed across parties, across bureaucracies. And the other fact is simple limits of power. Yeah. That's a basic point. You simply don't have the capacity to do, even if you can change a regime, right? You can change a regime, but can you make them govern? And I think that's a very good case study that we don't talk about, 1971. You actually did change a regime. That's the first case where India proactively uses force. And then a famine happens in 1974, and then Mujib is assassinated in 1975, and we can see what happens in Bangladeshi politics thereafter. And India was not able to shape the post-conflict, post-regime change situation in Bangladesh, and that's also something to bear in mind. These are lived experiences. So India's caution comes not out of theoretical exercises, but by actually trying it out and realizing that there are limits to how much you can succeed.
So India should be nimble-footed and cautiously prudent about these things, rather than shooting from its hip and going into its neighborhood. So that set things in right. Avinash, here is my last question. In a piece you wrote in October last year, you wrote, and I quote, "The decisive shift in its domestic politics to the Hindu right have begun to generate serious national security and geopolitical costs." Do you want to explain that pretty strong statement to our viewers?
Look, any sort of nationalism that is exclusionary in nature, anywhere in the world, will create pockets of resentment. It will create pockets of dissent, fundamental dissent. And that is a space which can be exploited by countries with whom you don't have good relations or whom you consider as adversaries, right? The whole idea of, one nation, one religion, one language, let's be very clear about this, that militates against the reality of India, right? Whatever the history might be. Even if you say that, okay, within the geographical territorial confines of India, you're successful in imposing that, you still have a large population that will remain unhappy. And that is a population that is you're exposing yourself for external interference, whether it's from Pakistan, from China, or whoever it might be at a future point in time. It's simple arithmetic of that sort. National security is not divorced from nationalism and politics, from domestic politics. And there is a very good reason why inclusivity, and I'm not going about democracy, secularism, basic principle of inclusivity is so important moving forward as far as India or countries like India are concerned, who have a history of conflict and conflicts that are still active. Northeast, yes, the insurgencies you can argue are not a strategic threat in the sense, the risk of actual secession in Assam or Nagaland does not exist anymore, or in Manipur. Even Kashmir, you have securitized it that you're not going to lose control in a huge territorial sense, but the fact that you need that much security in Kashmir, that you need so much security forces and security presence in the Northeast on a perpetual basis is a sign that there's limits to how far this kind of nationalism can take you.
Right. Avinash, fascinating insights. Thank you so much for joining me on the conversation.
Thank you for having me here. Happy. Thank you.
Get a sneak peek of exclusive content before everyone else for channel members only. Memberships start at ₹89. Hit the join button below.